Thank you to everyone who's here in person and to anyone who's online. I don't think anyone at the moment, but for anyone who trickles in perhaps later on, for being able to attend today. I think we've got a real treat on our hands. For anyone who doesn't know, my name is Spencer Erjavic. I'm a graduate research assistant and graduate student here at the Middlebury Institute. And I managed to sort of stumble upon this lecture here today. I was in Washington, D.C. in April for the 18th annual NATO W&D Non-Proliferation Conference. And while I was there, I stopped by the State Department to see some of my old friends and colleagues, one of whom is our speaker today. And I happened on an epiphany in the moment to have an idea of, you know what, I think it'd be really beneficial for everyone here in Monterey to be able to hear the perspective and experiences of someone who is currently an active practitioner in the US government, but also has lots and lots of experience over his time in government to talk about, or really whatever he would want to talk about. And when I broached the idea with him, he said, I think that's a great idea. And so after some negotiation and figuring out when to have it scheduled, we decided on today. And he wanted to talk about the implementation and verification of US-Russian arms control treaties over the years. And so without further ado, our speaker today is Mr. Neil Couch, currently serves as the Director of the Office of Verification, Planning, and Outreach in the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Arms Control Verification and Compliance. He was formerly the Deputy Director of the Office of Strategic Stability in the same bureau, and as Strategic Stability and Deterrence in the same bureau, and served as the U.S. Chairman of the Conforming Group on the New START Treaty Delegation. He manages verification and compliance assessments related to arms control agreements, as well as research and development for verification technologies, public affairs, and public diplomacy for the Bureau. He's also a congressional liaison and manages the Secretary's International Security Advisory Board, hosted within the Bureau. He was also served as the U.S. head of delegation to the International Partnership for Nuclear Disarmament Verification. Prior to this current position, Mr. Couch spent 2 years as a consultant with Booz Allen Hamilton. Mr. Couch retired from the United States Air Force in 2005. While in the Air Force, Lieutenant Colonel Couch served as an ICBM launch officer in 2 strategic missile wings, served as a space operations officer in 2 space wings, served as an instructor and commandant's executive office at the Air Command and Staff College, served in the National Security Policy Division on the Air Staff, and served as a military advisor to the Assistant Secretary of State for Arms Control. In his last assignment, he served as the Deputy Director of Arms Control Policy for the Office of the Secretary of Defense, managing issues related to strategic, conventional, and global or multilateral arms control treaties and agreements, including START, INF, Moscow, CFE Treaty, and the Open Skies Treaties. For his education, he has a BA in English from the Citadel in 1982, an MBA from Webster University in 1987, Executive Certificate in Public Leadership from Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government in 2019. He's also a graduate of the Air War College, the Joint Forces Staff College, Air Command and Staff College, Joint Senior Leaders W&D course, the National Security Executive Leadership Seminar, and the Pearson Canadian International Peacekeeping Center. And without further ado, and all that accreditation, I will hand it off to Neil Couch.
Thanks, Spencer. I appreciate it. I'll put out the standard disclaimer. I'm here to share my views on sort of the history of nuclear arms control, but I think all of that can be applied for the non-nuclear arms control communities as well. And unfortunately, as with every government presentation, you know, I'm handed a script that I must follow, but I'm happy to answer questions, and we'll get outside the script when we do that. So thank you for hosting me here at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies. I've enjoyed working with your faculty, graduates, and students, as well as reading your publications for many years. What you do here is important and it gets noticed. We certainly pay attention to it in our bureau back in Washington. Today, I'm going to discuss the mechanics of the START Treaty, the Moscow Treaty, and the New START Treaty. I don't plan to get into many of the policy issues related to the treaties. Rather, I'll focus on the nuts and bolts related to implementing those treaties. And I'm going to illustrate how the START Treaty and the Moscow Treaty influenced the New START Treaty, including its structure and some key concepts. This may be a comment on my age, but I believe I'm one of the few people left in the US government who participated in the negotiation and or implementation of all three of the treaties. So let's next, well, we got it. There we go. Okay, so next one. All right, so this slide and the next slide is an eye chart that I assume you'll be able to have access to. There is simply, actually this chart I originally put together for Rose Gottmiller when she was prepping for the ratification hearings for the New START Treaty. She kept getting asked all kinds of detailed questions across various treaties. So I just threw together a quick chart for her. And so that's the genesis of this table. So one more. So it includes this information as well. I'm not going to belabor this, so we'll just move on to the START Treaty. Okay, so what we now call the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or START, started on June 29th, 1982, as the Strategic Arms Reduction talks between the United States and the Soviet Union in Geneva. After an initial series of discussions, the Soviets suspended the talks on December 8th, 1983, alleging a change in the strategic situation following NATO deployment of intermediate range missiles in Western Europe. I won't go through the entire negotiating history, but the talks eventually got back on track, and on July the 31st, 1991, Presidents Bush and Gorbachev signed the treaty. The treaty still faced challenges as it took another 3 years for the ratification process, and it entered into force on December 5th, 1994. START was implemented in 3 phases, with all parties meeting their treaty-required reductions by December 4th, 2001. One comment on the parties to the START Treaty. As I just mentioned, the treaty was negotiated and signed by the United States and the Soviet Union, but by the time the treaty entered into force, the Soviet Union had broken up. To capture all of the Soviet Union's treaty-accountable strategic offensive arms, the United States negotiated the Lisbon Protocol to bring the Russian Federation, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine into the treaty, and under the terms of the corresponding Budapest Memorandi, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine were recognized as non-nuclear states. For the remainder of the treaty, we had 2 sides, but 5 parties. So the Russian side included Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine. So the treaty central limits, both sides were limited to 6,000 warheads attributed to deployed ICBMs and SLBMs and heavy bombers, and 1,600 strategic nuclear delivery vehicles. So those were deployed ICBMs and SLBMs and their associated launchers and heavy bombers. If I use an acronym that you don't understand, please let me know. It's easy for me to slip into treaty speak, and sometimes things that are just second nature for me or may not be to you. The treaty also had an extensive inspection regime with an annual quota of up to 28 inspections. Over the life of the treaty, the United States conducted 659 inspections and Russia conducted 481. Talk a little bit about attribution. Attribution is a counting rule in which a certain type of delivery vehicle is assumed to be equipped with a certain number of warheads. For instance, a Minuteman III ICBM was assumed to have 3 reentry vehicles or warheads, even if it was actually equipped with fewer. This counting methodology was used because inspectors would not always be able to confirm the actual number of warheads on a given delivery vehicle. So understanding the importance of attribution is important because it will influence the Moscow Treaty and will reappear in the New START Treaty. As with almost every arms control treaty, START had an implementation commission, the Joint Compliance and Inspection Commission, or JCIC. The JCIC held 34 sessions over the life of the treaty, meeting 2 to 3 times per year, and each session lasted up to 2 months. JCIC delegations were large, representing the U.S. intelligence or interagency included state, OSD, the Joint Staff, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, the Department of Energy, and the intelligence community. Russian delegations largely matched the U.S. delegation in terms of size and composition, but delegations from Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine were much smaller. A quick aside on the number of meetings of the JCIC, while the official count was 34 sessions, you will not be surprised that with the size of these delegations and the length of time that we spent in Geneva, these meetings were expensive for both the US side and the Russian side. So bean counters in Moscow and in Washington started to complain that we were spending too much money. So there were a couple of instances where the two heads of delegation agreed that rather than naming meetings, and they were named numerically. So instead of naming a session like number 20 and then the next one 21, there were times when they became 20A and 20B. So the sessions sometimes had carry forward, if you will, numberings. And the bean counters in Washington and Moscow were both okay with that. You know, as long as we didn't call it a new session, we continued to do that. So that's just a little aside, but that's why there were only 34 named sessions, but in reality, there were a few extra. Most of the JCIC's work was done by various working groups. For instance, the inspection working group, site diagrams, telemetry, conversion or elimination, throw weight. Often there were multiple working group meetings each day. Meetings were held at the US mission, the Russian mission. Occasionally, Ukraine would host it. They had a very small mission in Geneva. So they would host occasionally. Like I said, often we would have multiple simultaneous working groups in different meeting rooms. Rooms much like this, where we came together and discussed issues. And this meeting schedule is one of the things that drove the need for these large delegations, because you'd have enough people to cover each of these ongoing working group meetings from each of the interagency groups. So defense, state, Department of Energy, IC, everyone had to have enough people to be able to simultaneously staff each of these meetings. And finally, I want to mention treaty-related notifications that were exchanged on a daily basis. The START Treaty had more than 180 different notification formats that covered various topics such as movement of strategic offensive arms, eliminations, site diagram updates, scheduling JCIC meetings, and resupply of the old continuous portal monitoring facility at Budkins. So let's move to the next. So on the Moscow Treaty. The Moscow Treaty was signed on May 24th, 2002 and entered into force on June the 1st, 2003. The treaty was negotiated in less than a year by the Bush 43 administration which was frustrated by the START Treaty's complicated and bureaucratic approach to arms control. They were looking to embark, and this is a quote from the treaty, embark upon a path of new relations for a new century, in which the United States and Russia would further reduce their nuclear arsenals, but in a way that provided each side more flexibility and less of an administrative burden. The Moscow Treaty had one basic provision that each party shall reduce and limit strategic nuclear warheads so that by December the 31st of 2012, the aggregate number of such warheads does not exceed 1,700 to 2,200 for each party. Each party shall determine for itself the composition and structure of its strategic offensive arms based on the established aggregate limit for the number of such warheads. So when the Bush 43 administration came in, they really had an optimistic view of implementing further reductions in the US and Russian nuclear stockpiles, and looked at the Moscow Treaty as sort of a breath of fresh air. So the Moscow Treaty received a fair amount of criticism for its simplicity and lack of verification provisions that were found in the START Treaty. And so this may seem odd from a professional arms controller, but I'll defend the Moscow Treaty. Having participated by this time in several years of JCIC meetings, I too was frustrated by the slow pace of progress in resolving START Treaty implementation issues. I remember in the ratification process for the Moscow Treaty, and by this time I had moved from state back to OSD, working on the Office Secretary of Defense. And Secretary Rumsfeld would frequently show a copy of the START Treaty, which, if you've ever seen it, was about 4 inches thick, hundreds and hundreds of pages of very detailed provisions in that treaty. And he liked to contrast the simplicity of the Moscow Treaty with the very technical, complicated structure. So for the ratification hearings, he asked to be able to show that. So he would hold up this very thick, 4-inch thick notebook binder for the START Treaty. And I produced for him a wallet-sized card that I still have, keep one, that he would show, this is the complete text of the Moscow Treaty, all of it. And he would hold it up and say, you know, this is what arms control should be. So as I said, I was one of those who have sat through years of meetings in Geneva where the two sides would come in and we would read these very scripted talking points on some arcane inspection issue. And at the end of the meeting, both sides would shake hands and say that was very nice, but they were the exact same talking points that each side had read to each other for years. So neither side was willing to budge an inch on a particular issue. And it wasn't because the two heads of delegation or the working group chairs or whoever they were didn't want to make progress, but both sides genuinely felt that their view of the treaty text was correct and that their view of that issue was correct, and neither side was willing to give. So it was kind of a refreshing to go into the Moscow Treaty with a new approach, a new way of doing business. So I will defend the Moscow Treaty on that basis. When we made progress, it was at a snail's pace. So this new approach was refreshing. Besides, the parties agreed that the START Treaty remained in force in accordance with its terms. So the START Treaty was still there. And that meant that despite the Moscow Treaty's simplicity, the rigor of the START Treaty was still in place, at least for most of the life of the treaty. In addition, the Moscow Treaty had an implementation process, the Bilateral Implementation Commission. Over the course of the treaty, the BIC met 11 times, during which both sides provided extensive briefings on plans to meet the December 2012 reductions. They discussed the definition of operationally deployed to strategic nuclear warheads. And that was how the United States, I told you that the Moscow Treaty allowed a lot of flexibility for each side to implement those reductions in their own terms. So for the United States, we made those reductions based on operationally deployed strategic nuclear warheads. So in other words, how a weapon system was actually loaded. So rather than the attribution rule of the START Treaty, where a missile or a bomber was assumed to have a certain number of warheads, under the Moscow Treaty, we counted what was actually there. So the numbers that were reported in the Moscow Treaty were much more realistic in terms of the actual force structure sizes of both sides. The two sides also signed on one agreement under the terms of the Moscow Treaty, and that was an agreement on BIC operating procedures. In other words, how many times the BIC would meet in Geneva each year, what issues would be covered, and the administrative process for that meeting. That concept of operationally deployed is going to carry forward into the New START Treaty. So I'm trying to show you how things that rules like attribution rules, operationally deployed, how those concepts carry forward from one treaty to the next. So before we leave the Moscow Treaty, I'd be remiss if I did not mention the Consultative Group for Strategic Security, or the CGSS. The CGSS was established on the same day that the Moscow Treaty was signed. This strategic stability group which is what it really was. I don't know that I've ever seen it get any mention in academic articles or any real press, but it ran alongside as sort of a corollary to the Moscow Treaty, and met about 5 times in a similar format as the BIC. Both sides briefed on nuclear force sustainment and modernization, but unlike the BIC, the CGSS discussions were more policy-based than those in the BIC, which was strictly geared toward implementing the treaty. The US side pushed for discussions on non-strategic nuclear weapons and on nuclear doctrine. So between the BIC and the CGSS, the two countries exchanged a significant amount of information on their nuclear forces. So again, back to my comment on some of the complaints about the Moscow Treaty not having the rigor of the START Treaty. It's true that the Moscow Treaty didn't have any on-site inspections, but there was a significant amount of information that was exchanged in the course of both the BIC and the CGSS that actually supplemented a lot of the information that was continuing to be provided under the existing START Treaty. So let's move to the New START Treaty. The New Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or New START, was signed on April the 8th, 2010, entered into force on February the 5th, 2011. Both sides met the required reductions by the February 5th, 2018 deadline. The treaty was originally set to end on February the 5th, 2021, but was extended until February 5th of 2026. Toward the end of the Bush administration, they began to lay the framework for the Obama administration's planned negotiations, holding some preparatory meetings with the Russians and beginning to outline the text of the new treaty. This gave the Obama administration a head start on the negotiations, allowing President Obama and President Medvedev to sign a joint understanding or a high-level policy outline for New START on July the 6th, 2009. Full-fledged negotiations began shortly after in Geneva. And obviously, I think many of you know Rose Gottmuller is at Stanford. Rose was the head of the delegation for the United States. She was my boss on the delegation, and so she jumped right in on making sure that the negotiations got off to the right start. The New START Treaty is organized in 3 tiers of increasing level of detail. The first tier is the treaty itself. The second tier consists of a protocol to the treaty, which contained additional rights and obligations associated with treaty provisions. And then those basic rights and obligations are contained in these 2 documents that then led to the third tier of technical annexes to the protocol. The structure of the New START Treaty is very similar to the structure of the original START Treaty. It's not as long and detailed, but the basic outline is there. Under the treaty, the United States and Russia are limited to significantly fewer strategic arms than under the original START Treaty. And similar to the Moscow Treaty, each party has the flexibility to determine for itself the structure of its strategic forces within the aggregate limits of the treaty. And those are 1,550 warheads on deployed ICBMs, deployed SLBMs, and nuclear warheads counted for deployed heavy bombers, 700 for deployed ICBMs and SLBMs and heavy bombers equipped for nuclear armaments, and 800 deployed and non-deployed ICBM and SLBM launchers, and deployed and non-deployed heavy bombers equipped for nuclear armaments. This warhead limit is 74% lower than the limit of the START Treaty and 30% lower than the deployed strategic warhead limit of the Moscow Treaty. So I want to close the loop on the counting rules that we talked about earlier from START and New START, the attribution and the operationally deployed strategic nuclear warheads. So counting rules on ICBMs and SLBMs. Under the START Treaty, attribution rules were used to determine the number of warheads counted for each type of ICBM and SLBM. Each deployed missile of a given type was attributed with an agreed number of warheads without regard to the actual number of reentry vehicles emplaced on each individual missile. Under the Moscow Treaty, each party used its own methodology to determine which of its warheads would be counted against the treaty's limit on strategic nuclear warheads. Under New START, the number of warheads counted under the aggregate limit on strategic warheads is the actual number of reentry vehicles actually emplaced on those deployed ICBMs and SLBMs. An ICBM or SLBM is considered deployed when the missile is contained in or on a deployed launcher of that missile. Here's the drawback to the START Treaty on counting rules, and that is for heavy bombers. So under New START, each heavy bomber equipped with long-range nuclear air-launched cruise missiles was attributed with 10 warheads for the first 150 U.S. heavy bombers and 8 warheads for the first 180 Russian heavy bombers. For heavy bombers equipped with nuclear armaments other than long-range nuclear outcomes, each heavy bomber was attributed with 1 warhead. As I said, under the Moscow Treaty, each party used its own methodology for counting the number of strategic nuclear warheads associated with its heavy bomber forces. Under New START, 1 warhead is counted for each deployed heavy bomber, and a heavy bomber is considered deployed if it's equipped for nuclear armaments, unless it's a test heavy bomber or at a production or repair facility. under New START, the reason we did the attribution rule for heavy bombers was that neither side routinely loads actual nuclear war weapons on their heavy bombers. It's very rarely that either side does that. It's most likely done for training purposes, but not for operational purposes. And that's a good thing. But when we were negotiating the treaty, we could not, with a straight face, use the operationally deployed counting rule, because that would mean that under the terms of the treaty, neither side would have heavy bombers because they would all be at zero all the time. So we agreed to use that attribution rule carried forward from START for the heavy bombers, and so that each bomber counted as one. So that captured the heavy bombers into the treaty, but it does not reflect the loading, which is almost always zero. The treaty provides for 42 types of notifications, including updates to data changes and data, heavy bomber movements, and notifications on major strategic exercises. As of June the 1st of this year, the two sides had exchanged 25,720 notifications. All notifications are now paused due to Russia's purported suspension of the treaty. The treaty provides for 18 on-site inspections per year. There are two basic types. A type 1 inspection focuses on sites with deployed and non-deployed strategic systems, and type 2 inspections focus on sites with only non-deployed systems. Each side is allowed to conduct up to 10 type 1 inspections and 8 type 2 inspections annually. Inspection activities were paused in 2020 due to COVID and have never resumed despite stringent efforts by the United States to do so. Up until the pause, the sides had conducted 328 on-site inspections. In other words, up until that point, both sides used all of their annual 18 inspections each year. As with all arms control treaties, over the course of implementing New START, both sides have raised compliance concerns. I will refer you to this past year's New START implementation report. There's an extensive section on there that lists our concerns about Russian compliance. In essence, Russia's failure to meet in the BCC, Russia's failure to allow for on-site inspections, and as I said, their purported suspension of the treaty, the United States considers to be inconsistent with the treaty, and that we can call them not in compliance with the treaty. I'm not going to read all of that text to you. Russia has had concerns about U.S. compliance over the years. Normally, or not normally, but those concerns are related to U.S. procedures used to convert some B-52H heavy bombers and Trident 2 SLBM launchers. In order to meet New START force structure numbers, the United States took some of our heavy bombers out of the treaty, and some of our SLBM launchers, we converted them so that they're unable to launch those missiles. Russia has complained about our procedures since the beginning of the treaty, and they continue. Of course, had they met with us at the last BCC, we could have resolved those because we had the procedures in place to resolve the Russian concerns. As with START and Moscow Treaty, New START also has an implementation commission, the Bilateral Consultative Commission, or the BCC. It met 19 times in Geneva to discuss treaty implementation issues. The 20th session was scheduled to meet in Cairo, but Russia canceled and has since refused other attempts to convene a meeting. Russia remains legally bound by the New START Treaty, and its suspension is legally invalid. In response to Russia's violations, we have adopted several lawful countermeasures. We're prepared to return to full mutual implementation of New START and to discuss further steps in arms control that will help manage nuclear risk. Our readiness to engage with Russia on reducing nuclear risk naturally includes New START, but it also goes beyond this agreement. The United States continues to comply and provide information on ICBM and SLBM launch notifications in accordance with the 1988 Ballistic Missile Launch Notification Agreement. And we will also continue to provide notifications of exercises in accordance with the 1989 agreement on reciprocal advance notification of major strategic exercises. Both sides remain legally bound by the treaty's central limits. The United States continues to abide by those limits and to fulfill all of its New START obligations that are not addressed through U.S. countermeasures, which include, as I mentioned, pausing of notifications. We've taken note of Russia's statement that it will voluntarily adhere to the New START Treaty's central limits, and that the treaty's reciprocal central limits are in both countries' interest and play a vital role in nuclear stability. The United States continues to monitor whether Russia's actions are consistent with its statement that it will adhere to the treaty's central limits. On May the 15th, the United States chose to voluntarily release aggregate data on U.S. strategic offensive arms under the New START Treaty central limits in recognition that transparency is stabilizing and responsible, especially in times of tension. Russia has chosen to tie New START implementation to its war against Ukraine. This approach is deeply unfortunate and puts at risk New START in the future of arms control. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan gave a speech at the Arms Control Association annual meeting on June 2nd that stressed that the United States does not need to increase our nuclear forces to match or outnumber the combined total of our competitors in order to deter them. Nor does the United States need to deploy ever more dangerous weapons to maintain deterrence. Rather, effective deterrence means that we have a better approach, not a more approach. We can turn this moment of peril into a moment of possibility. Sullivan said the world is at an inflection point in our nuclear security and stability, and this demands new strategies. And that the United States is willing to engage in bilateral arms control discussions with Russia and China without preconditions. He noted that this does not mean without accountability. We will still hold nuclear powers accountable for reckless behavior, and we will hold our adversaries and competitors responsible for upholding their nuclear agreements. So I know this has been a lot of information, and I kind of intended to get into the nuts and bolts, and I hope that you have found this useful. And if you have questions, I'm here for you. Spencer, I'll let you run that part of the show.
Yeah, please. I have some questions that I'm more than happy to ask, but please, if any of you have questions already prepared, I welcome it. If not, I'm happy to give some of my own and perhaps give you all some food for thought and time to think of your own. Yeah, Dr. Potter, please.
Thanks, thanks for the overview. It's something that some of us have followed for, for a long time. And I don't know if you've encountered my colleague, who's based in Vienna, Nikolai Sokov, but he had responsibility for verification and when Linton was kind of leading the US delegation,
Right.
and I'm not sure if he's on the call, but I'm sure he would have lots of questions for you. I was kind of struck by your views on the Moscow Treaty, the attraction of its simplicity, and I wondered if I could draw you out on another approach, which also may have the virtue of simplicity, but there are downsides as well, and it has to do with the so-called PNIs, presidential nuclear initiatives, which is simpler in some respects because it didn't involve a negotiation.
Right.
And so I'm curious when your views on the PNIs, and also whether perhaps in a world such as today, where it, in my view, is impossible to even contemplate Senate ratification of anything, much less an arms control treaty, whether it makes some sense to kind of think again about these kind of parallel unilateral delegation declarations as an approach to arms control.
A lot of people have your same concerns with regard to the future of any negotiated agreement and whether it would pass the ratification process in the US Senate. And I think that's one of the reasons that you hear in Washington a lot of discussion about risk reduction measures, unilateral statements in line with what the PNIs did, and that is a likely way ahead for future understandings between the United States and Russia, between the United States and the PRC, if we can ever get to that point. If you recall, in the Trump administration, we put a lot of effort into trying to negotiate a trilateral agreement with the United States, Russia, and China. I think you're exactly right, though, that in the immediate future, any hope for a common understanding is going to be a political agreement in which both sides acknowledge the realities of where we are in relation to getting a ratified agreement, and maybe move along the lines of the PNIs, a Moscow Treaty-like approach without the treaty tied to it, I think is maybe a future. But as Jake Sullivan said, we're open to negotiation, and if you go back to the start, those talks took almost a decade, right, to get from start to finish. And so who knows if we started a negotiation now, and those were done under the Soviet rules. So while relations with the United States and Russia are certainly not great by any stretch of the imagination, we've successfully negotiated with Russia or the Soviet Union at times when tensions were high and relations weren't great. So that the current world security situation should not stop us from trying to overcome those challenges. Is that
sure? I mean, I can weigh in and kind of respond more, but I'd be pleased to have others, including Spencer, kind of take the floor for which. Yeah, I think Bill Lou was supposed to call, and I don't know if Bill is another person who might want to.
Thank you very much for giving your insights on these critical treaties. I believe that arms controllers and diplomats, and especially those who do both, they face two problems. And those problems are increasing manifold in the current environment. One is that arms controllers always have to strike a balance between maintaining deterrence and mutual vulnerabilities, and also reducing nuclear risks.
Right.
How do you look at that as a negotiator, as a long-time negotiator, and also once the treaty is ratified and agreed to and then ratified, and once the implementation phase starts, you as a negotiator can't control the external geopolitical events that could mar the implementation. So how do you go about navigating these challenges?
Well, you're exactly right. You can't control the world situation, and if you go back and as I kind of mentioned in the beginning points, right, that the START treaty there were several fits and starts on that negotiation, right? We go to Geneva, talk, world events intervene, both sides pack up and go home. You have to deal with that, and it requires commitment at the political level, at the head of government level, for all parties, and whether a future agreement is bilateral with US and Russia or multilateral with all nuclear weapon states, and this could transfer into the chem, bio world, AI, if we ever get there. But it requires a commitment at the political level by the heads of government to overcome those challenges. And if that commitment is there, you can move past whatever that world security situation is. And maybe that negotiation contributes to lessening that risk. And you're right also about arms control is in its relationship to deterrence, and you can those reductions. So if they're done in phases, as they have been since START and then Moscow Treaty and now New START, in each instance there's been a step down in the number of weapons on the US and Russian side. But yet both sides continued to maintain some deterrent force. If we were to move forward with a further set of reductions, then that moves us a little bit closer to the NPT obligations, right, of getting down to eventually to zero. But those are, I think it's going to be a long process, but it's going to have to take that step-by-step process, because no country is going to unilaterally disarm without some understanding with their opponents.
And I also think that it's particularly now that a lot of people say that arms control is impossible in the current political environment. That it's futile to try to decouple and sort of compartmentalize arms control, strategic stability from things that are happening, right? Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or the increase in China's nuclear arsenal, stuff like that, right? With broader geopolitical tensions. But on the flip side, you don't do arms control with your friends. Right. You do arms control with your adversaries, right, and people that aren't friendly to you. So, right. So even when it is tough, that's in some ways the best time to do it, because you can try to, salvage what's left at that point. Yes, please.
Yes.
Oh.
Thank you.
And please introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Rahman. I am here as a visiting research fellow.
Right.
I have a question that, first of all, thank you for the presentation. Sure. It gives a complete, comprehensive view. My question is related to the change of government, like how you see the change of government impact on ongoing arms control agreements, despite the fact that the state policy remains the same. I'm asking this question because if you see the case of JCPOA and the Trump administration dealing with that issue and now the Biden administration, so how do you see START agreements in that context, the change of government impact the process or the negotiations between the two parties or no?
If you're, is the question between US and Russia or US?
US itself,
Right.
how they see this progress towards this agreement.
I think the reality of China's increase in its nuclear forces over the last several years has caused many people to take a little bit of a pause with regard to what the US could do in a future agreement. So, all right, so what is our, when it was a US versus Russia deterrence equation with, China's forces very small, that the mathematics of that US and Russia deterrence equation was fairly straightforward to discuss, and we could both, over the course of different treaties, ratchet down those numbers. China's growth, I think, causes many in the US government to think twice about what the US needs and will need in the future for deterrence purposes. So that is a question that is yet to be fully answered. I think, there's a strategic posture commission that's going to release a report in the near future. And I think we'll see, and that's both sides, US and Republicans and Democrats are both on that. We'll see where that comes out for its recommendations. And I think that's going to really influence how we move forward. So I hope that addresses
Yeah,
it.
perfectly.
Okay, all right.
I got the dynamic.
Yes.
Thank you. John Dupree, I'm the Director for Education and Training Activities here, mainly dealing with our visiting fellows. But as I mentioned in my introduction earlier to you, I was a former South African diplomat, and so I'm going to put that hat back on, and I have to say this hat of the current South African policies doesn't really fit this big head anymore. But first of all, I think it is really unique for us to have you here, and thank you for your presentation of someone who has actually been involved in these three treaties. And as Bill mentioned, Nikolai Sokov was involved from the Russian side, and it's always very interesting to have discussions with him on this. So I want to make just a comment, and then I have two questions. And again, I'm trying to sort of put in this old South African hat on. It's all well and fine to look at the number of deployed weapons. And of course, in the NPT context, the US and Russia would always put that forward as, well, this is what we are doing to adhere to our Article 6 obligations, right? And in doing so, obviously seek the recognition for doing so, and rightfully so. But that's not the full picture, is it? I mean, the full picture is that there are twice as many, if not more, nuclear warheads in each of these countries' arsenals that are not deployed. And then there is a vast amount of material that came out of weapons that have been dismantled. And none of that material or weapons are out in any control, any international verifiable control. So the question that I have is, and there are two. One, how does the United States and the State Department, have the pleasure of dealing with many delegations of the US over time, how do you justify that large amount? And what is the what is the strategies to convince and share with the non-nuclear weapon states that you are actually dismantling and not just controlling a number, because 1,550 is a static number, right? It's just what is on the ballistic missiles or that can be used in the bombers. How do you convince them that that's actually part of disarmament? The second question is more related to Bill's question, also to Uma's question. The New START treaty obviously is going to expire. Right? Current environment doesn't suggest that you're going to have a new treaty. US-Russian relations is the lowest that it's ever been, and the domestic politics in the United States. Given what you just mentioned, which is really sobering, that with China's increase of nuclear arsenal, do you foresee that a Republican or Democratic president would have sufficient backing to do a presidential initiative if it comes to that? Or would it be the reverse? Would there actually be an increase in US arsenal? Thank you.
Well, let's start with the second question. And one, I don't have any way to say whether a future administration would see an increase or decrease in our force structure. But I think we can have some kind of, just like we just discussed, right? We can have a future transparency initiative, a political agreement in which both sides continue to exchange information. You know, the United States, so you talk about stockpile, the United States fairly regularly, not every year, but every few years, we do release our stockpile numbers. And I think that helps give other countries some assurance, because you can see a steady decline in our stockpile. That sharing of information, those transparency measures could help bridge the gap until some future agreement were negotiated. Absent a legally binding treaty, the United States has some legal restrictions on what we can and can't release under the Atomic Energy Act. So now, you know, that can be overcome. There are ways to do that. But there are some legal restrictions on what we can't release. And I think the United States, more than any other nuclear weapon state under the NPT, has been more transparent than any other of the P5. So I think we have a good track record of assuring our partners around the world of where our force structure lies. Back on your first question on, you know, we have a deployed number that meets the New START limits, but what about the thousands that are not covered in the treaty and storage facilities in Texas or New Mexico or wherever it might be? I will tell you, as a former military person, it is my view that the only weapons that really matter are the ones that are deployed. Those weapons in the stockpile, if there was an actual nuclear exchange, they're worthless as far as being able to use them militarily. You'll never be able to pull them out of the stockpile and deploy them and use them in a nuclear exchange. It's just not going to happen. So the ones that matter are the ones that you have already loaded and ready to use. As a practitioner, as a nuclear weapons a missile launch officer, I only am concerned about ones that can be used against my country right now, and those are the ones that are deployed. As far as how do we assure others and what we're doing, I look at things like the IPNDV, the International Partnership for Nuclear Disarmament Verification. I think that program has gone a long way to help the 25 or so partner countries understand how nuclear disarmament works, to hear from them their concerns, and I've heard their concerns. You know, they ask the same questions that you ask: is how can we be assured when you tell us that your stockpile numbers are going down? How do we know that when nobody has any way to verify those numbers other than what we report publicly? And we'll tell you that, you know, we're have no intention of ever allowing someone from another country to see that dismantlement process happen. We do talk about, and then in the IPNDV, we discuss how do you come up with procedures that allow a party to dismantle a weapon that's been in storage, so that what comes out of that dismantlement process, the results of that process could be verified, but not the actual dismantlement. So those discussions happen and continue to happen, and I think, and it's my view, that that kind of discussion with other countries does a huge amount of goodwill to get them to understand the technical complexities of the work, the dangers involved in the work. You know, nuclear weapons were put together with a single purpose, and they were not designed to undo that purpose. So the people at the Department of Energy who have worked diligently to come up with ways to dismantle weapons, my hat goes off to them, because they work hard to make that happen. There's a lot of work involved, and it's, like I say, it's very technical work, it's very dangerous work, and we continue to make progress in that, even in the absence of negotiations. So those stockpile numbers continue to go down. At the same time, you see pressures to make new warheads, right? You know, there's pressures for you'll see out of Congress pushing for new types of delivery vehicles, for new you know, if we ever went back to a sea launch cruise missile, so those kinds of warheads require new production, and so it's kind of a dichotomy, right? We dismantle some of the old ones, but at the same time we're pushing for increases. We'll just have to see where that goes, but I think the United States has made a great effort to assure our friends and allies and others around the world of what we're doing to dismantle that stockpile. Does that help?
Thank you. That was very useful.
Yeah.
Piggybacking off of that question and that discussion, I mentioned in the introduction the Undersecretary Bonnie Jenkins's International Security Advisory Board, and your office also oversees the Key Verification Assets Fund, which, for any who do not know, is essentially a project spearheaded by the State Department to invest in increasing verification technology capabilities, transparency measures, as well as various political measures, assurance, reassurance measures, things like that, that is funded by the State Department. So in that vein, what, from your perspective as a practitioner, what can we in academia do to help better facilitate newer, better implementation and verification methods, whether that's on the technical side, in terms of technology and sensing and analyzing warheads and so on, or on the political side in terms of being able to facilitate new at the political level in negotiations and in consultative committees for various treaties, new verification methods as we get closer and closer to zero.
Yeah. So as an academic institution, your academic work, when you publish papers, when you do research, as I said at the very beginning, it gets noticed. Right? So that helps the U.S. government and others formulate new ideas. It helps us be better prepared. Just because people like me have been doing this kind of work for many years doesn't mean that we have all of the answers. We depend on fresh ideas, new ideas from people around the world that can step up to the plate and offer new verification procedures, new technologies. So all of that helps us be better prepared when we meet with our counterparts and actually try to negotiate some agreement. You talked about the V Fund, the Key Verification Assets Fund. That is a small R&D program that we run every year. It's about $1.7 million on each year. That number can go up and down. We do those projects and we reach out to institutions like the James Martin Center here, and open to other NGOs and to the national labs, commercial institutions, to provide suggested inputs for the research questions that we pose. Due to the small dollar amount, our State Department R&D budget would not even be a rounding error for some of the DoD's projects. Even though they're small, we feel like they've been very beneficial to us over the course of years. We see them as seed money, if you will. If we can kind of get new ideas, new proposals for new technologies and procedures that we can then share with others in the government, like DoD or Department of Energy, that have much, much larger budgets, to then be able to really spend and develop and bring to the fore. So what you can do, like I say, is to continue to come up with new ideas, to continue to study the issues related to arms control, not necessarily in just the nuclear field, but across the spectrum. When you come up with new ideas, when you publish research papers, when you speak at conferences, we listen and we take it all in. So it's it's not just an academic exercise. It might be for you, if you're writing your master's thesis, it's an academic exercise. But when you present a paper at a conference, that we listen to those things. So it's important to us. So.
But you may not. I'm sorry.
No, please. No, please.
So I recall vividly. December of 2009, the State Department was on the cusp of, Rose was on the cusp of being able to conclude her negotiations. Much to the chagrin of her handlers in state, she agreed to participate in a meeting with our simulation students who were negotiating the same kind of an agreement with a Russian counterpart. We have students here, but there was an American and a Russian team. And she took over an hour from her busy schedule to engage, with the students. And so I think it was that kind of interaction that goes beyond simply reading what some of the scholars may produce. But there was a real sense of engaging with students who were hopeful someday of becoming negotiators like those. So we continue to have that kind of engagement, I think, with people in the US government. Unfortunately, given the hiatus in bilateral arms control negotiations, now Jean and I teach multilateral negotiations. So instead of Rose, we have people like Tom Countryman and Adam and China and others who engage with us. We can't really simulate this. Ours is a very realistic simulation. We can't simulate a bilateral negotiation at the moment. So renew that deliberation and we'll perhaps consider doing simulations in that domain as well.
And that's exactly what I've been trying to get at, is those kinds of interactions help all of us. And I hope by us talking to you that, gives you something to chew on as well to help your academic programs.
It would not be very kind to the janitorial staff anyway to have them clean up all the mud from a mudslinging competition as a US-Russian bilateral consultative commission meeting these days. Yeah, Mike, please.
I'm Michael Zutzman, and I'm a research associate here. This might be a bit too far down in the weeds, but in the mid to late 2010s, Russia was working on deploying a small ICBM called Rubej that caused a lot of concern about the INF treaty, but was on the face of it supposed to be an ICBM. How was that dealt with within New START? If you
I remember that. My recollection, I'm not going to go into a lot of details, that missile had a flight test that met the range limits that made it technically an ICBM, thereby taking it out of consideration of the INF treaty. So that's kind of where, and then of course INF eventually went away. So and my recollection is that it was never went much further than that for the Russian side. So but the Russians did what they had to do to meet the treaty requirements, so it was technically allowed.
Right.
Yeah.
Is that consistent with your assessment?
Yes, and then the program just kind of disappeared.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any questions? I don't know if you can see online. Are there any questions online or?
Not yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I have questions I can ask. So how these days, how realistic is it to take the US Soviet / Russian model of bilateral arms control and implement that into a future multilateral arms control treaty? Is that a good framework to start with, or is some sort of a trilateral treaty between the US, Russia, and China, like was attempted at the end of the Trump administration, or some sort of a quadrilateral US, UK, France, and Russia treaty, something like that? Is the bilateral framework a good framework, or would it require a whole different, sort of approach to handling, multi-site inspections from multiple different parties at the same time? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it is a good foundation. We have, several decades of experience of implementing START, Moscow Treaty, New START between the United States and Russia. As I told you in the START treaty, there were 5 parties and 2 sides. So at the beginning of the treaty, until all the weapons from Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine were returned to Russian territory and control. We did inspections in those countries. We verified that those weapons have been returned, that facilities had been eliminated and destroyed. There were members from Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus who participated on Russian inspection teams in the United States. So we have some experience in what was, in essence, a bilateral treaty allowing other parties to participate. I will tell you, when we started the New START negotiations, I tried to get Rose to agree to allow countries like Ukraine and Kazakhstan, Belarus, others to have some kind of observer status and keep them in the group. And Rose, you wisely did not take my suggestion because that would have just complicated things even further. But so I think that bilateral structure of implementing START and New START can serve as a foundation, and the problem with bringing the other, like if you wanted to bring all the P5 into an agreement, is that UK, France, and China have no real experience in implementing these kinds of agreements. So obviously we've done a lot of work over the years with the UK in doing training exercises, tabletop exercises, talking through how these kinds of inspections work. You see, this is all publicly released information. So the UK is aware of how the process works. So, but you'd have to get their governments and their militaries especially comfortable with how allowing another country to come in and see your most valuable weapons, if you will. And it's going to be especially difficult with China, because I mean, that's always been the hard nut to crack, is to get the Chinese military to agree to participate in even transparency negotiations. So hopefully we can, maybe get there. But, and I think that the foundation of bilateral arms control can be a model. Right? It doesn't have to be, it may not be all of the pieces of the START treaty or New START treaty or whatever, but pieces of it might serve as a foundation in a multilateral setting. And I think we also can look at like CFE, right? CFE can be a model for multilateral. Obviously, there were many participants in CFE, and while that inspection regime was under being used, I think was fairly effective. So instead of counting tanks, we go in and count missiles. So I think we have the foundation for a multilateral agreement in place. It's just a matter of picking the parts that you want to use.
And the political will.
And the political will. Without the political will, none of it will ever happen.
Okay, I have another
Question.
question.
I've been trying to convey to my students the role of bureaucratic politics and organizational processes in the multilateral negotiating process. And if you go back and, whether it's John Newhouse or Strobe Talbot or Ray Gardolf, the old kind of timers or some more contemporary, writers on arms control. Many of them point out, how much more difficult it appeared to actually get interagency agreement in the U.S. government than trying to negotiate with the Russians. I mean, the U.S. Navy is often kind of cited as a major obstacle to anything having to do with verification and measures like. So I wondered if you could maybe share with the group here a story, an anecdote or two involving, if you could share that with us, your experience, whether it's negotiating, with the Department of Energy, the Department of Defense, different bureaus within state, and how that kind of impacts also on the negotiating process.
Sure. And I've been on different sides of that equation. So the U.S. interagency in Washington, when we're discussing a particular topic, state, energy, Office of Secretary of Defense and Joint Chiefs, which a lot of people think of DoD as just one organization. You have to really think about OSD and Joint Staff as two separate entities. OSD is obviously the political side of defense, and Joint Staff is the true military side. The intelligence community, everyone has their own starting point, their own basis for how they need to defend essentially their equities. So we've had some really tough negotiations in Washington amongst the interagency. Sometimes the NSC, the National Security Council, has to intervene as sort of a referee, if you will, to get people to play nicely. It can be a challenge to get everyone on the same sheet of music, but I will say that once we make a decision and once we go and do the negotiations, that everyone in the U.S. delegation speaks as one voice. You asked for some index, so let me think. I'm not sure I have any that I can share right now. But I mean, no, I think I'll just leave it at that.
Job security trumps all.
If there's time for one more question.
Yeah.
So, and again, you may not be willing to answer this,
Yeah.
but this morning, the visiting fellows and I had a discussion on nuclear weapon-free zones, and in that context, we talked about nuclear sharing, the concept of obviously the US weapons in Europe. So I'm curious, I've always been wondering about this. Are these weapons included as deployed weapons, the gravity bombs?
They are not captured under the New START treaty, right?
Exactly.
So they are not included in that math at all.
So with your very useful comment earlier that, as a former nuclear missileer, weapons that are not deployed are useless. I mean, they sit, and these are sitting in bunkers, and they're aged, and so how do you continue to justify? I'm just asking you as a U.S. government official, justify the presence of those weapons in Europe, since they create a major problem in the NPT context, and as the fact that those countries, if you wish to consider that nuclear weapons provide security, those non-nuclear weapon states enjoy the security of those weapons. So in the face of these criticisms, how do you approach that? And then two, do you foresee that there's any potential leverage of those weapons vis-a-vis the US relationships, lack thereof, with Russia? A future role where those weapons could withdraw in exchange for something else?
Well, I suppose they could certainly become leverage at some point. As far as US extended deterrence, and especially with regard to our extended deterrence with NATO, it's a touchy subject, and I'm not going to say a lot about it, but the United States continues to maintain its commitments to NATO. NATO has made multiple public statements that as long as nuclear weapons exist, the allies will be it would be a nuclear capable alliance. So officially we won't discuss locations and what countries, and I'm not going to get into that, but yeah, I understand your question, but I'm just not gonna. I'm not gonna say anything that will cause problems.
So, any other questions? Any online or? Okay. Well, before we wrap up, I'm gonna ask one more question. It's not about NATO.
Yeah.
It's a sort of professional career advice question for anyone here online or who might be watching this recording back or something, who is studying here or works at CNS or something, who is interested in this field of work as a practitioner. What advice would you give from your life, and your experiences working in the U.S. government, at multiple different aspects of the U.S. government, who would be interested in getting into that career, either as a civil servant in the United States or working at, perhaps at the international level, UNIDIR, UNODA, the CTBTO, something like that? What advice would you give to them who wants to pursue that type of career?
So number one, don't follow my career path. I don't think it will ever exist again. I like to tell people I was actually born to do this. When I was born, my father worked at the Savannah River plant in Aiken, South Carolina, making tritium, and then I grew up to be an Air Force missile launch officer. And then when I went into the space business, I did satellites that worked in the nuclear arena. And then I came to Washington and was sent to the State Department to work on nuclear arms control. And that's kind of what I've done. So in one form or fashion, I've worked in the nuclear business since I was born. So I don't recommend that for others. But for you who are now students who want to pursue a career in this, from the State Department perspective, we, people like me we're going to age out. And we need young people to come in because you have to, you need to build experience. And so we have programs at the department. There's, we have special hiring authorities under the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. She can hire people directly in. We have what we call the STEM FAR, for technical and foreign affairs young hires who can come in and get experience. And there's a few other programs. The Department of Energy has a similar program that occasionally state will hire from. So coming into the Department of State, there's different venues, right? There's through the regular civil service hiring process. You may be interested in the Foreign Service, not the civil service. So there are opportunities in the Foreign Service to work in this career field. But the Office Secretary of Defense hires people. They're bring in young people as well. So there are ways to get into the government to do this kind of work. But as Spencer said, it's not just in the government, working for various think tanks, Carnegie, Nuclear Threat Initiative, Plowshares, others, where you can contribute to the field. And what I've found over the years is that for many folks, they come in and out of the government, right? They may start at an NGO, or they may pursue just a straight academic career and then come into the government, usually through the political process, work for a few years, go back out, come back in. So you'll see people who come and go, and you'll and every time they come back, they a little bit higher up until they're the boss. So there are many ways to develop the experience that you need to contribute. So, studying in an institution like this is great. And then participating in academic forums, in different exchanges, all of those are helpful to build your resume, to give you an opportunity to work in this field. It's hard to say where Arms Control will go in the future. If it's going to become a series of transparency measures, or if we'll get back to the treaty world, we'll have to see. But you are the folks who will shape the course of that. It's not going to be me.
Thank you. Yeah. And I think on that optimistic note, we will leave it there. So thank you for coming out here. It's been such a pleasure. And please, if everyone could give a warm round of applause.